Good morning, students. Welcome back to our second to last lecture in our World War II series. So please be prepared to take notes. As always, the notes will be able to be used on your Google Forms as well as your unit test for the World War II unit. Again, just a quick take a look at the image behind me. This particular image comes from a punk rock band that hails from the San Francisco Bay Area. So please give yourself some extra credit and guess who they are. So if you would please get ready. Our lecture today is titled The Allied Victory. Our essential question is, how are the Allies able to turn the tide against the Axis and win the war? I would like you to focus on key tide-turning battles, meaning who were the combatants, who won, what was the significance, and again, be able to prepare or explain how World War II was a total war. Our objective is to state how the Allies won World War II. So, the tide of the war begins to turn. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler ordered submarine raids against ships along America's East Coast. And in the first 4 months of 1942, after the United States had declared war on Germany, the Germans sank 87 US ships off the Atlantic shore. 7 months into the year, the Germans had sank a total of 681 Allied ships in the Atlantic. The Allies would respond by organizing their cargoes into convoys or groups for mutual protection. And in fact, at this time, it was reported that a U-boat had been seen off of the coast of Virginia by beachgoers. Now, the convoys would be escorted across the Atlantic by destroyers, and these would be equipped with some of the newest technology, which was sonar. And the sonar would be able to detect subs that were underwater and airplanes that used radar to spot subs on the ocean's surface. These two technologies, sonar and radar, were created during the war itself. Now, with this improved tracking, the Allies were able to find and destroy German U-boats faster than Germans could rebuild them. And at the same time, the US would launch one of the first total war programs, which was to turn regular industrial works in the United States into shipbuilding programs. And by early 1943, 140 ships were being produced each month. And for the first time in the war, launchings of Allied cargo ships would begin to outnumber the sinkings. And by mid-1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic would turn forever in the Allied favor. Now, as the Atlantic made the first time that the Allies would truly go against the Nazis on water, the first real fighting on land would start in November of 1942. Now, the Nazis had conquered large swaths of the European continent as well as much of North Africa. So in November 1942, North Africa would mark the first spot where the United States would launch an assault against Nazi soldiers. And 107,000 armed troops, most of them Americans, commanded by U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, would land in Casablanca, Morocco, Algiers, Algeria, in North Africa, and they would speed eastward, chasing the Afrika Korps that was led by General Erwin Rommel. And after months of heavy fighting, the last Afrika Korps surrendered in May of 1943. At this point, British General Harold Alexander sent a message to Winston Churchill, reporting that all enemy resistance had ceased and that they were now masters of North African shores. What this gave the Allies was a soft area in order to get into the European continent. They would now be able to either go through southern France, which was held by the Vichy government, or the Italian peninsula, who was held by the Italians, who were seen as the weak point into Nazi Europe. Now, while all of this was happening, Hitler was meeting his downfall in Russia. Now, the Nazis would go on to stab Joseph Stalin in the back, as we covered before. And this would be probably Hitler's biggest fatal flaw. So Hitler would send his troops to capture a city called Stalingrad, now called Volgograd, which was one of the main USSR industrial centers on the Volga River, in August 23rd of 1942. Now, obviously, August is entering the summer, but it is creeping into the fall. And this would present a huge problem for anybody that would ever want to fight in Russia, which means to say that they were definitely going to fight throughout the winter. Now, by early of November 1942, the Germans controlled 90% of the ruined city, but then the infamous Russian winter sets in. And on November 19th, Soviet troops outside the city would launch a counterattack, waiting for the first snows. Now, closing around Stalingrad, they would trap the Germans inside and cut off their supply lines. Now, this would essentially be a siege where they would basically starve the Germans out, even though there would be a lot of hot fighting as well. Now, on February 2nd, 1943, 90,000 frostbitten, half-starved German troops would surrender the city to the Soviets. The survivors were all that would remain of an army that was initially 330,000. Stalingrad's defense had cost the Soviets over 1 million soldiers, and the city was 99% destroyed. However, now the Germans were on the defensive, and the Soviets would push them steadily westward, and not to mention one of their most well-trained and battle-hardened armies would be completely decimated. Now, as this was going on, and after North Africa was seized, it was made the decision to invade into Italy. Italy was seen again as the weak point into Nazi Europe, and so therefore it was the best place to attack. So the Americans argued that the best approach to victory was to assemble a massive invasion fleet in Britain and launch it across the English Channel through France and into the heart of Germany. But Churchill, however, thought that it would be safer to first attack Italy to again soften up the Germans. Now the Allies compromised and they went with Churchill. They would push ahead with plans for the cross-channel invasion later, but the first attack, like I said, would be coming in Italy. So the Italian campaign got off to a good start with the capture of the island of Sicily in the summer of 1943. And at this point in time, the Italians, basically the Italian people and the Italian king, more or less give up on the war. And on July 25th, 1942, King Victor Emmanuel III would summon the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini to his palace, and he would strip all power away from Mussolini and have him arrested. And many Italians felt that this was the end of the war. However, unfortunately for them, Hitler would respond by launching a full-scale invasion against Italy, rescuing Mussolini from imprisonment and reinstalling him as a leader and ordering German troops to dig in and hold firm, which they did. It would take another 18 months of fighting in the mud and mountains for the Allies to drive the Germans from Italian soil. Now, one of the hardest fought battles in the Allies encountered in Europe was fought less than 40 miles away from Rome. It was this battle, Bloody Anzio, lasted 4 months and left about 25,000 Allied and 30,000 Axis soldiers dead. And during the struggle, the Allies, supported by 5,000 Italian partisans or resistance fighters, were able to harass the Germans by cutting telephone wires, derailing trains, and dynamiting bridges and roads. And on April 28th, 1945, the resistance fighters who would ambush a Nazi convoy and they would find Mussolini disguised as a German soldier trying to make an escape over the Austrian border. Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, as well as other fascist leaders, would be caught by the partisans near the Italian Lake Como as they attempt to escape over the border, and they would be shot, and their bodies would be transported back to Milan, where they would be hung up by the heels in the main city square, and the mob would go on, or mobs would go on to mutilate their corpses. Now, as the Allies pushed forward, the Soviet army would move into Poland. And meanwhile, the England and General Eisenhower would begin organizing the largest land invasion in the history of the world, something called Operation Overlord, which would be the planned invasion of Hitler's fortress. D-Day, which was the main part of Operation Overlord, would be in the planning for 2 full years, where the U.S. and Britain would go on to build up an invasion force and landing crafts of nearly 3 million troops to attack Axis forces on the other side of the English Channel. Eisenhower hoped to take the Axis by surprise and pinpointed the relatively lightly fortified Normandy Peninsula as the focus of the assault. To make reinforcements of the German forces more difficult, once the invasion began, the Allies would begin bombing northern France supply lines, roads, bridges, and rail lines for a month and a half before the planned assault. Now, interesting about particularly the Norman Peninsula, the more sensible spot would have been the port city of Calais, which is only about 25 miles across the English Channel from the English port city of Dover. So in this case, they were able to create a ruse by basically setting up the invasion forces further west and crossing the channel at a much longer place. However, this would basically fool the Nazis very effectively. So obviously there's England. This gap here, if you see right here, is the where they would do their invasion. Calais is right here. However, the Norman Peninsula is right here. And so therefore, this would be further to travel. However, it would catch them off guard. These would be the attacking points. You would have Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold, Juno, Sword would be the fighting points where they would invade. So the American forces would take Utah and Omaha. British forces would attack at Gold and Juno, and coalition forces would attack at Sword Beach. Now, the day of the invasion had originally been set for June 5th, but bad weather would force delays. And banking on a forecast for clearing skies, Eisenhower would give the go-ahead for the next day, June 6, 1944. And this would become the day that is infamous in history. 3 divisions would parachute down behind the German lines during the night, and British, American, and Canadian troops would fight their way ashore 5 points along the 60-mile wide stretch of beach. 150,000 troops, 4,000 landing craft, 600 warships, and 11,000 planes would land that day. And this was the largest land-to-sea air operation in the history of the world. Now, despite the massive air and sea bombardments by the Allies before the invasion, the German retaliation would still be particularly brutal. On Omaha Beach, people would be yelling, screaming, dying, running on the beach. Equipment was flying everywhere. Men were bleeding to death, crawling, lying everywhere, firing coming from all directions. We dropped behind anything that was the size of a golf ball. Omaha Beach, if you have ever seen a picture of it, is about 50 yards of beachhead with about a 50 to 100-foot cliff that was heavily fortified with pillboxes and machine guns. So it was a very, very difficult place to land. And in fact, that is where my grandfather, my dad's father, was part of the landing force on Omaha Beach. Now, despite heavy casualties, the Allies held the beachhead, and within a month, they had landed over 1 million troops, 560,000 tons of supplies, 170 vehicles in France. And on July 25th, General Omar Bradley would unleash a massive air and land bombardment against the Nazis at the French city of Saint-Lô. And what this would do is it would give General George S. Patton and his Third Army a gap that they would need to advance further into France. And on August 23rd, they would reach the Seine River south of Paris. And 2 days later, French resistance troops and US troops would liberate Paris after 4 years of German occupation. Now, by September of 1944, the Allies would also go on to free France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and much of the Netherlands. This was good news with the American people, and they had no desire to, as they say, change horses in midstream, and so they would elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt to an unprecedented fourth term in office in November, along with his running mate, Senator Harry S. Truman from Missouri. Now, Germany was at a breaking point at this part in the war, and their last main ditch effort would be at the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 and 1945. However, this last part would be well defended by George S. Patton and his Third Army, and the Allies would roll across the Rhine River into Germany. By the middle of April, 3 million Allied soldiers, or American and British soldiers, would be approaching Berlin from the southwest, and another 6 million Soviet soldiers would be approaching from the east. And by April 25th, 1945, the Soviets would be surrounding the capital, and they were pounding the city with artillery fire. At this point in time, everything was lost for the Nazis. And while the Soviet shells burst over Berlin, Hitler would prepare for his end in his underground bunker beneath the crumbling city. On April 29th, he would marry his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun, and the next day they would commit suicide together. Eva Braun would eat a cyanide capsule. Hitler would also eat a cyanide capsule, and impatient for it to start, he would also shoot himself. Their bodies would be burned and carried outside and burned by his adjuncts. Now, on May 7th, 1945, General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of the German Third Reich and all of the German military. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt suddenly would die a few months before and did not see the German surrender. Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, would receive the news of the Nazi surrender, and on May 9th, the surrender was officially signed in Berlin, and the US and other Allied powers celebrated something called VE Day, in which stood for Victory in Europe Day. And after 6 years of fighting, the war in Europe would officially be over. Now, with the war in Europe done, that left the war in Pacific. And if you're tired for the time being, I would say take a pause here and take a break. However, I'm going to power on. Now, although the war was over in Europe, the Allies were still fighting in the Japanese in the Pacific. And with the Allied victory at Guadalcanal, the Japanese advances in the Pacific had basically been stopped. For the rest of the war, the Japanese would be continuously retreating as the Allies would continue to attack. By the fall of 1944, the Allies were moving in on Japan. In October, the Allied forces would land on the island of Leyte in the Philippines and begin to liberate the Philippine Islands from Japanese control. General Douglas MacArthur would wade ashore at at Leyte with his troops, and upon reaching the beach, he would declare, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." In essence, to say that he has captured them. Now, Leyte, the Japanese did not give up easily with Leyte, and in fact, they used this as their last chance, basically their last ditched effort. They devised a plan that would more or less destroy the American fleet and prevent the Allies from resupplying their ground troops and basically isolating them. But this also required risking almost the entire Japanese fleet to do this. They took the gamble on October 23rd, and within days, the Japanese Navy had lost disastrously, eliminating as a fighting force in the Pacific. And now only the Japanese Army and the Japanese Air Force, which included the feared kamikazes, stood between the Allies and Japan. On a quick side note, the Japanese kamikaze would be what we call suicide pilots. Kamikaze in Japanese stands for divine win, which actually harkens back to victory against the Mongol forces that tried to invade Japan. And what they would basically do is they would use their planes as dive bombers and blow up ships with them. You were not expected to necessarily come back from a kamikaze mission. However, it is a misconception that they chose to die every time. If you could destroy your target and successfully make it back, then you were permitted to live. But if you were wounded or you ran out of fuel, you would then use your plane as a weapon. Now, in March of 1945, after a month of bitter fighting and heavy losses, U.S. Marines would take the island of Iwo Jima, which was 760 miles from Tokyo. Then from there, they would island hop to the next fortified island, the island of Okinawa, about 350 miles from southern Japan. Now, the Japanese would put up a desperate fight on the island of Okinawa, but nevertheless, on June 21st, the battle would be over. The Japanese would lose over 100,000 troops, while the Americans would lose only 12,000. Now, Okinawa and Iwo Jima would teach the Americans a valuable lesson, and that is the Japanese were willing to fight to the last man to defend their territory. Now, it also, on Okinawa, was the first time that the Americans had come into contact with Japanese civilians, and they were very much distressed by the way that the Japanese civilians reacted to them, mainly by committing suicide. And so this put a pause to the way that the Americans would move forward in their battle plans, and very much changed what we would call their calculus to what we're going to talk about in our next topic. That is the mobilization of the scientist. Now, in 1941, FDR would create the Office of Scientific Research and Development and bring scientists into the war effort. Their main idea was to improve both radar and sonar, new technology for locating submarines underwater and catching incoming airplanes. And they would also push the development of drugs such as penicillin, which would save countless lives on and off the battlefield. But the greatest achievement of the OSRD was the new research and development of the atomic weapon. Now, the interest in the weapon began in 1939 after German scientists succeeded in splitting the uranium atom, which released enormous amounts of energy. This news prompted physicist and German refugee Albert Einstein to write a letter to President Roosevelt, warning that Germans could use this discovery to construct a weapon of enormous destructive power. Roosevelt responded by creating the National Committee on Uranium to study the new discovery. And in 1941, the committee reported that it would take 3 to 5 years to build an atomic weapon. Now, hoping to shorten the time, the OSRD would set up a crash program in 1942 to develop a bomb as quickly as possible. And because their offices were located in New York City, this project became called the Manhattan Project. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, or maybe fortunately, he died on April 12th, 1945, and he would not see the atomic weapon be produced or used. Now, upon his death, Harry Truman would become the president, and he would grapple with a new job as a president, and specifically his job as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now, not long after Truman took office, Secretary of War Stimson handed him a memo that began, "Within 4 months, we shall have the probability completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. One bomb of which could destroy a whole city." Now, over the next hour, the president learned that the Manhattan Project was not only the most ambitious scientific enterprise in history, it was also the best kept secret. Nobody knew, including the Vice President of the United States, that we were producing this weapon. Now, at its peak, more than 600,000 Americans were involved in the project, although most of them had very limited knowledge of what they were actually doing and did not know the ultimate purpose, which was the creation of the atomic weapon. Now, work would begin on the bomb in 1942, and a group of scientists under the direction of physicist Enrico Fermi would successfully achieve a controlled nuclear reaction in the University of Chicago. And General Leslie Groves, the organizer of the Manhattan Project, had 2 gigantic atomic reactors built, one in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and another in Hanford, Washington, to produce uranium-235, which was the rare form of the element, along with an even rarer form, or rarer element, plutonium, to fuel the massive explosive device. Meanwhile, a group of US, British, and European refugee scientists, headed by J. Robert Oppenheimer, worked in secret laboratories in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the actual bomb. As time to test the bomb drew near, the air around Los Alamos crackled with rumor and fear. At one end of the scale is that the bomb wouldn't work. At the other was that it would produce much of a punch. And then there was the idea that it would actually set fire to the atmosphere, which would kill everybody on the face of the earth. So on the night of July 16th, 1945, the first atomic bomb would be detonated in an empty expanse of desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico. The blinding flash would be visible for 180 miles. That's basically from Elk Grove to Fresno, and be followed by a deafening roar as a tremendous shock wave would roll across the desert. One scientist described the huge mushroom cloud as a red-hot elephant standing balanced on its trunk. But my favorite description of the bomb came from Robert Oppenheimer, the creator of the atom bomb, where he just said, "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." And that lets you know what this bomb would do. Now, on July 25th, Truman ordered the military to make final plans of dropping the atomic bomb on existing Japanese targets. A day later, the US warned Japan that it would have faced prompt and utter destruction if it didn't surrender at once. Now, the Japanese refused. There's a lot of debate on whether this was the right decision, but many people believed it would cost upwards of $1 million American soldiers, not to mention the countless civilian deaths if there was an actual invasion of the main Japanese islands. Truman would later write that the final decision of where and when to use the atomic bomb was up to me, and let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used. So on August 6, 1945, a B 29 bomber by the name of the Enola Gay released the first atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, over the Japanese industrial city of Hiroshima. Um, this was an important military and civilian target. 43 seconds later, um, the bomb would detonate, and almost every building in the city would collapse, and Hiroshima would cease to exist. Now, at this point, the Japanese still hesitated to surrender. So, 3 days later, a second bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. This did not quite have the effect of Little Boy, but it still leveled half the city. By the end of the year, an estimated 200,000 people, about 120,000 in Hiroshima and about 80,000 in Nagasaki, would die as a direct result of the weapon and radiation poisoning caused by the atomic blast. So Hiroshima is on the Japanese island of the main Japanese island of Honshu, and Nagasaki was on the smaller Japanese island of Kyushu. If you see the before picture of Nagasaki at the top, with a bustling city, and the after picture, which basically looks like bare ground. Here is another picture of the devastation. Here is some pictures of what the victims looked like after the devastation. This brought a prompt end to World War II. World War II ends with the German surrender on May 8th and the Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945. Wartime conferences to figure out what would happen after the war started in February of 1945 with the Yalta Conference, and then in July of 1945 with the Potsdam Conference, which would basically start under a cloud of mistrust between the Allies and Russia. This would go on to establish the United Nations, which would first meet in April of 1945. The first session was convened on January 10th, 1946, in Westminster Central Hall in London, and included representatives from 51 nations, 1946, and again in June of 1946. By June, they agreed on a charter, and the charter created a General Assembly, which was made up of all of the members, or all member nations, and it was expected to function as a town meeting of the world. The charter also set up an administrative, judicial, and economic governing bodies. There would be an 11-member Security Council that would hold real power, though 5 main wartime allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union, would be given permanent seats on the Security Council. And at the insistence of the USSR and the United States, each permanent member had the power to veto any council action, and the other 6 seats would rotate to countries elected by the General Assembly. All right, thank you for that, and sorry for the longness, but there was a lot to cover there. So remember, for your Google Forms, you're going to write a summary of our essential question, you're going to address the objectives, and you are going to be asked some questions about tide-turning battles. All right, thank you very much. If you have any questions, please let me know. All right, thank you, and have a good day.